For most of the relationship, the avoidant operates from the belief that they don't need anyone, that independence is strength, that needing another person means weakness or vulnerability they can't afford. This belief is the cornerstone of their entire attachment strategy, the foundation of every wall they've built, the justification for every withdrawal and every maintenance of distance. They've structured their entire life around the principle of not needing, of being self-sufficient, of ensuring that no one becomes essential enough that losing them would be devastating. But there comes a moment for some avoidance, not all, but some, when this foundational belief shatters, when they can no longer maintain the fiction of not needing, when the walls they've built so carefully crumble and they're left facing a truth that terrifies them. They need you. Not in the abstract way they've acknowledged caring about you or valuing the relationship. They need you in the visceral, undeniable, life-altering way they've spent their entire existence trying to avoid. This realization doesn't come easily or quickly. It emerges through accumulated loss, through the slow recognition that life without you is emptier than life, with the vulnerability that needing you requires, through the breaking down of defenses that can no longer protect them from the reality that you've become essential in ways they never intended to allow. Understanding what happens when the avoidant finally realizes they need you reveals both the depth of transformation this represents and the profound fear it triggers, the internal crisis it creates, and the choice it forces them to make between their protective patterns and genuine connection. The moment their defenses finally crumble. The moment when the avoidance defenses crumble and they can no longer deny that they need you isn't typically a single dramatic event. It's more often a gradual erosion followed by a sudden collapse, like a dam that's been weakening imperceptibly until one day it gives way all at once. The defenses that have protected the avoidant from acknowledging need are sophisticated and multi-layered. They minimize the importance of the relationship. They focus on your flaws to justify distance. They maintain other options to prove they're not dependent. They keep themselves busy to avoid feeling the absence. But these defenses require constant maintenance, and they start failing when the avoidant can no longer avoid the reality that life without you isn't just different. It's diminished in fundamental ways they can't rationalize away or compensate for through other connections or activities. The crumbling often begins with small recognitions that accumulate over time. The avoidant experiences something they want to share and realizes you're the only person they actually want to tell. They face difficulty and notice that your presence would make it more bearable in ways that self-reliance doesn't address. They achieve something and recognize that the accomplishment feels hollow, without you, to celebrate it with. They spend time with other people and notice that none of those connections satisfy the way connection with you did. Each of these moments chips away at the defense that the avoidant doesn't need anyone, that all connections are interchangeable, that they're fine alone. The defenses crumble more dramatically when the avoidant tries to replicate what they had with you and discovers it's impossible. They might date other people, seeking someone who makes them feel the way you did, someone who understands them as you did, someone who sees past their defenses the way you did. But these attempts fail, not because the other people are inadequate, but because you're not replaceable. The avoidant has to confront that what you offered wasn't generic. It was specific to you, to your particular way of being, to the chemistry and understanding that existed between you specifically. This recognition that you're irreplaceable rather than interchangeable destroys the defense that the avoidant can find what they need elsewhere, that walking away from you meant walking toward equivalent or better options. The moment of complete defensive collapse often arrives during a crisis or a moment of profound loneliness where the avoidance self-sufficiency fails them and they realize viscerally that they need you. They're dealing with loss, with failure, with illness, with existential despair, and their typical coping mechanisms, staying busy, intellectualizing, maintaining independence, don't work. They need comfort, need presence, need someone who knows them deeply enough to understand what they're experiencing. And the only person they want, the only person who could provide what they need, is you. This moment of crisis breaks through years of conditioning about self-sufficiency because the need is too acute to deny, too overwhelming to manage alone, too specific to be met by anyone else. The defensive collapse also involves the avoidant confronting that the life they've built around independence isn't actually fulfilling, despite being exactly what they thought they wanted. They have autonomy, they have freedom, they have space, they have the ability to make all their own decisions without compromise. But these achievements feel empty rather than satisfying. The avoidant realizes that what they've been defending against, needing someone, depending on someone, building a life that's intertwined with someone else's, is actually what would make their life feel meaningful rather than just functional. The defenses were protecting them from the wrong thing. They were protecting them from vulnerability, while what they actually needed protection from was the isolation their defenses created. The moment when defenses crumble includes the avoidant facing that their patterns have cost them something irreplaceable. They've pushed away someone who loved them, who saw them clearly and stayed anyway, who gave them patience and space while also maintaining their own worth. The avoidant recognizes that finding someone else who offers what you offered, genuine love combined with healthy boundaries, patience combined with self-respect, understanding, combined with unwillingness to accept dysfunction indefinitely, is unlikely. The defensive narrative that they can always find another relationship if this one doesn't work collapses when they recognize that relationships like what they had with you are rare, that people like you are not abundant, that they've lost something exceptional while operating under the false belief that it was ordinary and easily replaced. The crumbling of defenses also involves the avoidance identity shifting in ways that allow them to acknowledge need without experiencing it as complete weakness or loss of self. They begin to distinguish between healthy interdependence and the kind of desperate dependency their defenses were built to prevent. They recognize that needing you doesn't mean losing themselves, that depending on you in some ways doesn't require abandoning their autonomy entirely. That vulnerability in intimate relationship is different from the vulnerability that hurt them in childhood. This cognitive shift allows the defensive walls to come down because the avoidant develops a more nuanced understanding of what needing someone actually means. Not the overwhelming engulfment they've feared, but the mutual reliance that characterizes secure partnership. The moment of defensive collapse is often accompanied by physical and emotional responses that the avoidant can't ignore or intellectualize away. They cry, which they rarely allow themselves to do. They feel anxiety that persists despite their coping strategies. They experience longing that won't resolve through distraction. They lie awake at night thinking about you when they should be sleeping. Their body is telling them what their mind has been denying, that they need you, that your absence is wrong, that the protective distance they've maintained is causing more pain than the vulnerability of closeness ever did. This somatic experience of need is what finally breaks through the intellectual defenses, making denial impossible and forcing the avoidant to confront what they've been avoiding, that they need you, and that recognizing this need is the first step toward possibly getting you back, or possibly having to live with the consequences of realizing what they lost too late to reclaim it. What triggers the avoidance recognition of need? The avoidance recognition that they need you doesn't typically happen while you're still pursuing them, still available, still hoping they'll change. It emerges when specific conditions are met that force them to confront what your absence actually means, when the protective distance they've maintained reveals its costs clearly enough that the avoidant can no longer ignore them. Understanding what triggers this recognition illuminates why accommodation and patience often don't work. The avoidant needs to experience actual loss or its genuine possibility before they can face how much they actually need what they've been pushing away. The primary trigger for recognizing need is your genuine unavailability rather than performed distance. When you're truly unavailable, emotionally moved on, involved with someone else, building a life that doesn't include space for them, the avoidant faces real loss rather than managed distance. They can't take comfort in knowing you're waiting, can't reassure themselves that they could return whenever they're ready, can't maintain the illusion that you're a constant they can take for granted. This genuine unavailability triggers panic that breaks through their defenses because the possibility of never having access to you again is more frightening than the vulnerability of admitting they need you. Another trigger is witnessing you thriving without them in ways they didn't expect. The avoidant may have assumed that their absence would diminish you, that you'd struggle without them, that you needed them more than they needed you. When they see instead that you're happier, more vibrant, more alive without the burden of their inconsistency, it destabilizes their self-concept. They realize they weren't the more independent one, the stronger one, the one who needed less. You were the one who maintained yourself while they were actually dependent on having you there pursuing them, accommodating them, organizing your life around them. This reversal of perceived dependency triggers recognition of how much they actually needed you, not for survival, but for the particular way you enhanced their life that they took for granted. The trigger also includes the avoidant experiencing multiple other connections and recognizing none of them compare. They date, they develop friendships, they try to find connection that fills the space you occupied, but repeatedly, they discover that other people don't understand them the way you did, don't see past their defenses the way you did, don't make them feel the particular safety and chemistry that existed with you. This pattern of inadequate substitutes forces the avoidant to confront that you weren't interchangeable, that what you offered was specific and irreplaceable, that losing you meant losing something they cannot recreate elsewhere. The failed attempts to find equivalent connection trigger recognition that they need you specifically, rather than just needing any relationship. Recognition of need is also triggered when the avoidant faces difficulty and realizes they want you in ways that surprise them. They lose a job, experience health problems, face family crisis, go through something challenging that strips away the performance of having everything under control. In these moments of genuine vulnerability, they realize that you're the person they want to turn to, the person whose presence would make the difficulty more bearable, the person they trust enough to be weak with. This realization that you're who they need during crisis breaks through their defenses about not needing anyone and forces them to acknowledge that dependency they've been denying. The trigger can also include time passing and the avoidant recognizing that they're not moving on, that they're stuck in patterns of comparing everything and everyone to you, that their life has continued but hasn't improved in the ways they expected without the relationship's complications. The avoidant thought freedom from relationship intensity would bring peace and fulfillment. Instead, they experience something more like numbness or hollowness, life continuing without particular joy or meaning. This persistent lack of fulfillment triggers recognition that what they lost, connection with you, was actually what made life feel rich rather than what made it feel burdensome. Recognition of need is also triggered when the avoidant hears about you being happy with someone else or seriously dating someone new. The reality or possibility of you building a life with another person activates the avoidant's fear of permanent loss in ways that your general unavailability might not. They imagine someone else occupying the place they once had. Imagine you sharing with someone else what you shared with them. Imagine your life moving forward completely without them. This visualization of concrete replacement triggers recognition that they need to be the person in that position, that watching someone else have what they pushed away is intolerable. The trigger can include the avoidant having a significant life event, a milestone birthday, a major accomplishment, a transition moment, and realizing that you're who they want to share it with, that experiencing it without you feels incomplete, regardless of how many other people are present. These marker moments force recognition of need because they highlight who matters most, who the avoidant wants bearing witness to their life, who they want celebrating their joys and supporting their challenges. When the person they instinctively reach for in these moments is you, when they realize you're the one whose presence would make these experiences meaningful, it triggers recognition of how deeply you're woven into their sense of what matters. What triggers the avoidance recognition of need ultimately is the combination of your absence being real enough that they can't take your presence for granted, enough time passing that they've tested whether life is better without you and discovered it's not, and enough self-reflection that they can acknowledge their need without experiencing it as total weakness. These conditions don't always align. Many avoidants never reach this recognition because they remain defended, because you remain too available, because they never sit with loss long enough to feel its weight. But when these triggers do activate recognition of need, they create a crisis for the avoidant that forces them either toward transformation or toward resignation, that they're incapable of the vulnerability that genuine connection requires. How they process the terrifying reality of dependency. Once the avoidant recognizes that they need you, they enter a period of processing this recognition that's characterized by profound psychological turmoil. For someone whose entire identity and attachment strategy have been built around not needing anyone, acknowledging need is existentially threatening. It contradicts everything they've believed about themselves, challenges the defensive structure they've relied on since childhood, and exposes them to the exact vulnerability they've spent their life avoiding. The processing of this realization is rarely straightforward or quick. It involves wrestling with fear, shame, resistance, and the terror of what acting on this need would require. The processing begins with the avoidant cycling between denial and acceptance of their need. One day they fully feel that they need you, that life without you is unsustainable, that they must find a way to reconnect. The next day, they convince themselves they're being dramatic, that the need will pass, that they can overcome it through willpower and independence. This cycling reflects the internal battle between the emerging truth of their dependency and the defensive structures that resist that truth. The avoidance mind keeps trying to return to familiar patterns, minimizing the relationship's importance, focusing on your flaws, reminding themselves of the discomfort intimacy caused. But these defensive maneuvers no longer work as effectively because the recognition of need has undermined their foundation. The processing includes profound shame about needing someone after having spent so long priding themselves on independence. The avoidant feels weak, feels like they've failed at the one thing they were supposed to be good at, not needing people. They're embarrassed by how much they miss you, by how often they think about you, by how unable they are to simply move on and find someone else. This shame can be paralyzing because it makes the avoidant reluctant to reach out, reluctant to admit to you or to anyone else what they're experiencing, reluctant to show vulnerability after having been so defended. The shame intensifies because the avoidant recognizes that they're feeling exactly what they accused previous partners of feeling: needy, dependent, unable to be complete without the other person. The avoidant processes their need through intellectualization, trying to understand it cognitively rather than just feeling it. They research attachment theory, trying to understand whether what they're experiencing is healthy or pathological, whether it represents growth towards secure attachment or regression into desperate dependency. They analyze the difference between needing someone in healthy, interdependent ways versus needing someone from unhealed wounds. This intellectual processing helps the avoidant make sense of unfamiliar emotions, but it can also be a defense mechanism that keeps them from actually acting on their need, from moving from understanding to action. The processing also involves the avoidant testing whether the need is real or whether it's temporary panic that will fade. They try to distract themselves to prove they can be happy without you, to demonstrate to themselves that the need is manageable. They engage in activities, spend time with others, pursue work and hobbies with intensity. But throughout these attempts at proving their self-sufficiency, they discover the need persists. It doesn't fade with time or with distraction. It remains constant, a background awareness that something essential is missing, that they're going through motions of living without experiencing the fulfillment that your presence provided. This persistence of need is what finally convinces many avoidants that what they're experiencing is real rather than temporary, that it requires action rather than just management. The avoidant processes their need by imagining reaching out to you and working through the various outcomes that might follow. They imagine you welcoming them back, imagine you rejecting them, imagine you being involved with someone else, imagine you requiring things from them they're not sure they can provide. This mental rehearsal of possibilities is both preparation and procrastination. Preparation for actual outreach, but also a way to avoid taking action by staying in imagination rather than reality. The avoidant may spend weeks or months in this mental rehearsal, trying to work up courage, trying to develop the right words, trying to determine whether reaching out will result in the reconnection they need or in rejection that will make their loss permanent and undeniable. The processing includes the avoidant confronting what admitting need would require them to do differently. They recognize that they can't just express that they need you and expect that to be sufficient. They'll need to demonstrate they've changed, to address the patterns that ended the relationship, to be vulnerable in ways they've never been before. This recognition of what will be required can be overwhelming enough that some avoidants choose not to act on their need at all, deciding instead to live with the loss rather than face the vulnerability of transformation. They calculate whether the pain of continued separation is greater than the terror of being that exposed, and this calculation determines whether recognition of need translates into action or remains private acknowledgement that changes nothing. The avoidant processes their need through conversations with trusted others, cautiously revealing what they're experiencing to see how it's received. They might tell a close friend or therapist, "I think I need them," and gauge the response. If the response is validating, that needing someone isn't weakness, that reaching out is worth the risk, it reinforces the avoidant's emerging understanding that need is acceptable. If the response is dismissive, that they're better off alone, that needing someone this much is unhealthy, it can push the avoidant back into defense and denial. The processing is significantly influenced by whether the avoidant has support for this transformation or whether their social circle reinforces the avoidant patterns they're trying to overcome. The processing of dependency's terrifying reality ultimately determines whether the avoidant moves from recognition to action or whether they remain stuck in awareness that doesn't translate to behavioral change. Some avoidants process their need and choose to act on it despite their fear, reaching out to you, doing the work to address their patterns, risking vulnerability for the possibility of reconnection. Others process their need and decide the risk is too great, that they'd rather live with loss than face the terror of depending on someone, that their defenses, however costly, feel safer than the alternative of genuine vulnerability. The processing period reveals whether the avoidance capacity for growth is sufficient to overcome their fear, whether their need for you is powerful enough to override their need for protection, whether they possess the courage to choose connection over the defensive isolation that's kept them safe but alone for most of their life. The internal battle between need and fear. Once the avoidant has processed that they need you and cannot deny or minimize that need, they enter an intense internal battle between the pull of that need and the fear that acting on it triggers. This battle is the crucible that determines whether the avoidant's recognition of need results in transformation, or whether fear wins and the avoidant chooses their familiar defenses over the vulnerability that reconnection would require. Understanding this battle illuminates why some avoidants who clearly need their partners still don't return, why recognition of need doesn't guarantee action, and what internal work the avoidant must do to choose need over fear. The battle manifests as competing internal voices that the avoidant experiences with exhausting intensity. One voice says, "You need them. Life without them is empty. You'll regret forever not trying to reconnect. The relationship could be different now that you understand yourself better." The other voice says, "Needing someone gives them power to hurt you. If you go back, you'll lose yourself again. They'll reject you anyway after how you treated them. You're better off alone, where at least you're safe." These voices alternate in dominance, leaving the avoidant vacillating between determination to reach out and conviction that maintaining distance is wiser. The fear that battles against need is multi-layered. There's fear of rejection, that you'll say no if they reach out, that you've moved on, that you're unwilling to give them another chance after how they behaved. This fear of rejection is particularly potent for avoidants because they've built their entire strategy around protecting themselves from rejection by never making themselves vulnerable enough to be rejected. Reaching out to you after recognizing they need you is the ultimate vulnerability, and the possibility that you'll reject them confirms their deepest fear that needing someone leads inevitably to pain. This fear can be paralyzing enough to prevent action, even when the avoidant desperately wants to reconnect. Another layer of fear involves losing autonomy and sense of self. The avoidant fears that if they admit they need you and reconnect with you, they'll become the dependent person they've always disdained, that they'll lose the independence that's been central to their identity, that they'll be consumed by the relationship in ways that make them unrecognizable to themselves. This fear is often rooted in early experiences, where closeness meant losing themselves, where caregivers were intrusive or engulfing. Even though adult relationships don't have to replicate those dynamics, the fear persists that needing someone inevitably leads to losing oneself. The battle also includes fear that they're not capable of change, that even if you give them another chance, they'll revert to old patterns and hurt you again. The avoidant has enough self-awareness to recognize that recognizing their patterns isn't the same as having overcome them, that wanting to be different isn't the same as being able to sustain different behavior. They fear that they'll promise change. You'll believe them, and then their attachment wounds will reassert themselves, and they'll find themselves withdrawing again despite their intentions. This fear of inevitable failure can make the avoidant reluctant to try at all, choosing instead to preserve the possibility that they could have changed, rather than testing whether they actually can, and potentially confirming that they can't. The internal battle includes the avoidant weighing the pain of continued separation against the terror of vulnerability. They're suffering without you. They've recognized that clearly. But the suffering is familiar and manageable. They know how to survive loneliness and longing. What they don't know is how to survive the vulnerability of admitting need, of reaching out, of potentially being rejected, of being in relationship without their defenses. The unknown terror of vulnerability can feel more threatening than the known pain of separation, and this calculation can tip the avoidant toward choosing the familiar suffering over the terrifying possibility of connection. The battle also involves the avoidant wrestling with pride and ego. They constructed an identity around being the one who doesn't need, the one who leaves, the one who values independence over connection. Admitting they need you, reaching out after they were the one who created distance, acknowledging they were wrong about being better off alone. All of this requires ego death that's profoundly uncomfortable. The avoidant must choose between preserving their ego and getting their needs met. And for some, the ego protection feels more essential than the relationship. The internal battle includes the avoidant confronting the specific fear of what you'll require if they return. They imagine you having boundaries they'll need to respect, expectations they'll need to meet, patterns they'll need to address. The freedom of separation, no one's needs to consider, no one's disappointment to manage, no one's expectations to navigate, is comfortable even if empty. The avoidant fears that returning means accepting responsibility for meeting your needs, and they're not certain they can consistently do so. This fear of inadequacy, of not being able to be what you need, even if they want to be, can keep them from reaching out because they'd rather not try than try and fail. The battle also involves the avoidant recognizing that reaching out is just the first step, that if you accept them back, they'll face ongoing work of maintaining presence, managing their triggers, staying engaged when every instinct tells them to withdraw. They're not just choosing whether to reach out, they're choosing whether to commit to a fundamentally different way of being in relationship. This recognition of the sustained effort required can be overwhelming. It's not just one vulnerable moment of admitting need. It's committing to ongoing vulnerability, ongoing discomfort, ongoing work against their natural inclinations. Some avoidants recognize this and choose not to begin something they're not confident they can sustain. The internal battle between need and fear ultimately comes down to the question, is the pain of living without you greater than the fear of the vulnerability that having you back would require? For some avoidants, the answer is yes. The need is so powerful, the absence so painful, that they choose to risk vulnerability despite terror. These avoidants reach out, do the work, face their fears, because the alternative of living without you has become intolerable. For other avoidants, the answer is no. The fear remains more powerful than the need. The defenses remain more essential than the connection. The familiar protection feels safer than the unknown territory of genuine dependency. These avoidants live with the recognition that they need you while choosing not to act on that need, accepting a life that's less fulfilling but feels more controllable, choosing the known discomfort of isolation over the unknown terror of vulnerability. What happens when they choose need over protection? When an avoidant finally chooses to act on their need rather than remain protected behind their defenses, when they decide that life without you is more painful than the vulnerability of admitting they need you, a profound transformation begins that extends far beyond the immediate act of reaching out. This choice represents the avoidant overriding decades of conditioning, contradicting their core survival strategies, and accepting the very dependency they've spent their life avoiding. Understanding what happens when the avoidant makes this choice reveals both the courage it requires and the ongoing work it demands, illuminating what it means when an avoidant truly chooses you over their protective patterns. When the avoidant chooses need over protection, the first thing that happens is they reach out in ways that demonstrate genuine vulnerability rather than testing the waters with breadcrumbs. They don't send vague messages or casual check-ins. They express directly that they miss you, that they need you, that they recognize they made mistakes in how they handled the relationship. I've realized I need you in ways that terrify me to admit. I know I hurt you with my patterns, and I'm not reaching out lightly. I've been doing real work to understand why I withdraw, and I want to talk to you about what I've learned and what I hope could be different. This level of directness and vulnerability is unprecedented for the avoidant and signals that something fundamental has shifted. What happens next is the avoidant follows their vulnerable outreach with consistent action rather than retreating after initial contact. They don't reach out once and then disappear when you respond cautiously. They maintain presence, they continue communication, they demonstrate through sustained behavior that their outreach wasn't impulsive or motivated solely by temporary loneliness. They show up to conversations you need to have about what went wrong previously. They answer your questions about what's different now. They're present through the discomfort of accountability and uncertainty, rather than withdrawing when the reconnection process triggers their familiar urge to create distance. When the avoidant chooses need over protection, they commit to ongoing work on their attachment patterns, rather than assuming that recognition alone constitutes change. They enter or continue therapy specifically focused on avoidant attachment. They read extensively about attachment theory and apply what they learn. They identify their triggers for withdrawal and develop strategies for managing those triggers without creating distance. They work on communicating about their need for space rather than just disappearing. They practice staying present during difficult emotions rather than shutting down. This sustained work demonstrates that they understand transformation requires ongoing effort rather than one-time decision. What happens is the avoidant begins tolerating vulnerability in ways they never have before. They share their fears with you, their fear of losing themselves, their fear of being trapped, their fear that they'll hurt you again despite their intentions. They allow you to see their struggle rather than presenting a managed, controlled version of themselves. They cry in front of you. They admit when they're feeling overwhelmed. They express need rather than maintaining the stoic independence that characterized their previous presentation. This vulnerability is deeply uncomfortable for the avoidant, but they choose it anyway because they recognize that connection requires it, that you can't truly know them if they remain defended, that the relationship can't deepen if they only show up when they're feeling controlled. When the avoidant chooses need over protection, they prioritize the relationship in ways they didn't before. They make time for you even when work is demanding. They include you in their life and plans rather than keeping you compartmentalized. They introduce you to people who matter to them. They discuss future concretely rather than keeping everything vague and non-committal. They make decisions with consideration of how those decisions affect you rather than acting unilaterally. This prioritization demonstrates that they've recognized the relationship's importance and are willing to adjust their life to accommodate it rather than expecting you to fit into their existing structure without any change from them. What happens is the avoidant accepts that needing you doesn't mean losing themselves, that dependency and autonomy can coexist, that they can be in relationship while maintaining their sense of self. This cognitive shift is crucial because it's what allows the avoidant to sustain their choice over time. They discover through experience that being close to you doesn't actually result in the engulfment they feared, that expressing needs doesn't make them completely dependent, that vulnerability doesn't destroy them. These discoveries are only possible when the avoidant chooses to act despite their fears, rather than allowing fears to dictate their choices. The actual experience of sustained intimacy begins to rewire their expectations about what closeness means. When the avoidant chooses need over protection, they also face setbacks and old patterns resurfacing, but they respond to these setbacks differently than before. When they feel the urge to withdraw, they communicate about it rather than just disappearing. When they start shutting down emotionally, they name what's happening and ask for patience as they work through it. When they notice themselves creating distance, they course correct rather than allowing the distance to expand. These moments of recognizing and interrupting their patterns demonstrate that the transformation is ongoing, that choosing need over protection isn't a one-time decision, but a repeated choice made daily as triggers arise. What happens when the avoidant chooses need over protection is they build a relationship that looks fundamentally different from what existed before. One characterized by consistent presence rather than oscillating availability, by emotional openness rather than defended distance, by mutual vulnerability rather than one-sided exposure, by genuine partnership rather than one person accommodating the other's limitations. This different relationship becomes possible not just because the avoidant chose to return, but because they chose to return differently, because they recognized that having you back required being someone capable of actually being in relationship, rather than maintaining relationship adjacent existence while protecting their core self from genuine involvement. The choice of need over protection also changes the avoidant at a fundamental level beyond just their behavior in the relationship. They develop capacity for intimacy they didn't have before. They become less afraid of their own emotions and needs. They recognize that strength includes vulnerability rather than requiring its absence. They understand that connection enhances rather than diminishes them. They discover that being needed and needed by another person is deeply satisfying rather than threatening. These internal shifts mean that even if the relationship with you doesn't ultimately work, the avoidant has transformed in ways that will affect all their future relationships, all their connections, their entire way of moving through the world. What happens when the avoidant finally chooses need over protection is rare and precious. It's an avoidant choosing growth over comfort, choosing you over their defenses, choosing the terrifying unknown of genuine intimacy over the familiar safety of protective isolation. This choice doesn't guarantee the relationship will succeed, doesn't erase all the damage previous patterns created, doesn't mean the work is complete. But it represents a fundamental shift from someone incapable of sustained partnership to someone committed to developing that capacity, from someone who needs to keep you at arm's length to someone who's willing to let you all the way in, from someone whose fear controlled their choices to someone whose love and need are powerful enough to override that fear and create possibility for genuine, lasting connection that serves both people rather than only serving the avoidant's need for protection from the very intimacy they simultaneously crave and fear.